So one of the things that we're going to talk about today is the progressive era. Now, I'll have you note this is out of chapter 18 out of your textbook, but your author talks about it in a slightly different way than I will. He goes into some different details. I'm going to kind of give you the big picture again, and I want to point out one other little difference here. So I talk about the progressive era, right? Progressive era, and I've got the dates 1890 to 1917, and he goes a little differently. He starts in 1900, and I want you to understand why we talk about it differently and in slightly different ways. So when we talk about, as historians, we talk about eras. And we talk about periods of time in which things occurred, right? When things happen, you can see kind of the beginning, you can see kind of the end. There are going to be things that happen before and things that happen after that fit in that time period, but for the most part, we're going to get the most of these ideas in a period. So we'll talk about this again when we get to the 1950s. But this is really what we're talking about here. So we're talking about the same thing, your textbook author and I, but I tend to go a little differently on the dates than he does, and that's okay. So what was the progressive era, and who were the progressives? Well, you have this whole series of problems going on in the United States in this time period. We already read about the Gilded Age and urbanization and some of those different issues. We've got mass immigration, which we talked about, and we'll talk about a little bit more in this section. But you have all sorts of problems with overcrowding, with unsafe housing conditions, with unsafe working conditions. Those factory workers are being packed into those factories, and there are no safeties in place for them. We've got a lot of people being killed, all sorts of problems like this. So the progressives are people who see these problems and see them as long-term problems, not just these short, fixable things, but longer-term problems. But they're also optimistic that we can progress. They have the idea that history is progress over time, and that they will be better than the generations who went before them, and they will be able to fix these problems and make the world a better place, basically, right? So they see these problems. So who were the progressives? And I think your textbook author does a good job talking about this, but I just want to make sure that you get a good understanding of this. So first, it's important. This wasn't a narrow, organized group, right? They didn't wear a button that said "I'm a progressive" or something like that. This is people who had a like mindset and were moving forward and claimed to have the same ideas for progress. So it wasn't a set political party or something like that. Different politicians claimed to be of the progressive view and that sort of thing. Uh, so who were they? Well, they weren't, for the most part, um, your textbook author talks about them being forward-looking businessmen. And that was a part of them, right? These people who ran businesses and ran factories and wanted to make change and wanted to make improvements. Uh, you also have social scientists, people who wanted to use statistics and studies, academic work to make their point and then improve things. But you also have a lot of individuals that are going to come together out of mainly the middle class. And part of the reason these are going to be mainly middle class is fairly obvious, right? If you're poor and you're working 12, 14, 16-hour days, and you're doing all this work, you're not necessarily going to have time to go and fight for your rights or protest at something, right? It's going to be people who have time and who have the ability to do that. The super rich in this time period, especially part of that Gilded Age, they're just not interested in what's happening to the working class or to in the urban areas of the cities. or they're not, they just don't see it, right? They're just not exposed to it. They're too isolated. So you're going to end up mainly with middle class. Some upper middle class for sure. Eleanor Roosevelt was a great example of someone in this time period of the turn of the century who was definitely of the progressive bent and took action in that era. But it's for the most part going to be middle class people. You're going to have a lot of educated people, middle class educated people. Again, this comes together a little bit, but you do have at this time period this growth of colleges and universities, growth of them for women, growth of them for African Americans, right? Howard University and other historically black colleges and universities are started in this time. So this idea of being educated about the problems, about solutions, different things like this is going to make this a particular group as well. You're also going to have a lot of them are going to be young or young-ish. When you're young, you have greater opportunity to make change. It's easy to sit back and say, oh, look at all the fuddy-duddy middle-aged people who sit around, but middle-aged people have a lot more at risk. They have jobs, they have homes, they have families they have to support, maybe their parents, maybe their children, and they're locked into what they can and cannot do and the risks they can and cannot take. The risk becomes much higher in pushing for change when you're of a certain age. Where when you're younger, you have more freedom. It may not feel like it, but you really do. You have less responsibility, less commitment. You're taking care of yourself most often, not always, obviously, but the risk reward is a different ratio than when you're older and have greater responsibilities. So that's a big part of it, and a lot of them are going to be women. So you do have a lot of men who are progressives. I don't want to say that there aren't prominent men progressives, but this is a movement that women are really very vocal in, very active in, and take a leadership role. Again, as individuals quite often, but think of women like, Ida B. Wells and women like that are going to step forward and make a difference. Okay. So these progressives have this kind of new idea about what poverty is and how it's caused. There's a real shift in this time period about poverty. The old views about poverty were, if you're poor, then it's your fault. It's a punishment from God. It's you deserve it. You're lazy, you're sinful, you're stupid, something like that, right? If you're poor, that's it. It's on you, and we shouldn't help. We'd be interfering with the way of the world or with God's view or whatever. There's a real shift here in maybe the poor aren't to blame. Maybe the poor are stuck in a cycle of poverty that they can't get out of. And if the poor aren't to blame, then who is? Right? Whose fault is it that you have people who are poor and who aren't able to care for themselves? And so the progressives start to look toward who is the problem, and they think about big businesses that have those monopolies that you learned about reading about the Industrial Revolution, companies that own an entire industry, and then they can pay really low wages and demand a lot of labor. You have political party machines, unfair voting practices, unfair gerrymandering, which is where you draw the lines of congressional districts and local districts to weaken the vote of different groups. So they start to look for change. What's going on, and what can we change so you don't have poor people, so everyone has a chance to succeed. And then you start to have an eventual shift where the federal government is going to pick up on some of these ideas and going to have kind of a dampening down of some of those bigger pieces of progressivism. Okay. So in the next video, we're going to talk about these different phases of progressivism. We'll have these 4 different phases, but I'll stop here and give you a chance to take a little break and then come back for the 4 phases of progressivism.